Hello, welcome to Behavioral Health 101, Introduction to Behavioral Health. Today we'll be discussing aging and services for older adults. So, to start off, let's talk about this phenomenon known as the graying of America, which refers to the projected increase in the older adult population because of the aging baby boomers. The baby boomers are those Americans who were born between 1946 and 1964, and this started right after World War II, when all our soldiers came back from the war ready to basically start their lives, get married, have lots and lots of babies, which resulted in 76 million baby boomers. Taking into account people who have died early, people who were born before 1946, and immigrants who came to the United States before 1964, this accounts for approximately 25% of the American population. Older adults in the United States today experience a broader range of challenges. Several reasons for this include an increase in human lifespan, and you'll see in this chart on the right that we have almost doubled our lifespan in the 20th century. Changes in the perception of old age. In the United States, we see old people as kind of leeches on society. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm saying that's a bad thing. Whereas if you go to a country in Asia, for example, Japan, old people are seen as revered, wise, honored individuals. Changes in the economy. Changes in the American family dynamic, including the increase in divorce and the prevalence of two-parent working families. So let's talk about human life expectancy. During the 20th century, human life expectancy extended by approximately 50%. In 1900, the lifespan in the United States was about 47 years. By 1999, it had grown to about 77 years. So that 30 years is pretty significant in 100 years. So why are we living longer? Primarily because of improved medical technology. Currently, there are approximately 40 million people over the age of 65 living in the United States. From 1900 to 2050, the over 65 population in the United States will have grown from about 3 million in 1900 to almost 90 million in 2050. In terms of the economy, the economic crisis that started in 2007 and 2008, which is also known as the global financial crisis, resulted in the forced retirement and unanticipated layoff of many aging individuals within the workforce. The older population will have an impact on the financial, housing, medical, mental health, and even transportation needs of the older adult population. So imagine you are in your late 50s, you have been working at a job your entire life in manufacturing maybe, and your company in 2008 was forced to close because the bank that held the financing went under. You now are in a situation where you are competing with people who are a third of your age, 22, coming out of college, who have more education than you, and also much younger and want the same jobs. So these folks had a really hard time digging themselves out of the hole that was created by the global financial crisis. Then we have the changes in the family structure. Divorce rates have put some older adults in the position of having to provide daycare for their grandchildren, and in some cases even parenting their grandchildren. Daycare is super expensive, and if grandma or grandpa can provide daycare, that is something that a lot of young people have asked their parents to help them with. Retirement, increased physical problems, and widowhood will also have an impact on those in later adulthood. Erik Erikson is a psychotherapist who developed a theory on psychosocial development, beginning with birth and ending with death. According to Erikson, each stage of development presented a unique challenge or crisis. Successfully resolving the developmental crisis resulted in being better prepared for the next stage. The quote-unquote old age stage of Erikson's model, the crisis is integrity versus despair, and spans from age 65 to death. Erikson believed that individuals in this age range need to reflect back on their lives, reviewing their choices and the value of their various achievements. If this reflection results in a sense of contentment with one's choices and life experiences, then the individual will be able to accept death with a sense of integrity. If, on the other hand, he or she does not like the choices they made, they regret a lot, the relationships they develop, they regret, and they do not feel like they gained wisdom, then he or she will face death with a sense of despair. So, you live your whole life, you get to that point where you are an old person, you look back on your life, if you are happy and content, you have lived your life with integrity. If you are miserable and you regret everything, you have lived your life with this sense of despair and you fear death. Daniel Levinson's theory was that adults do continue to grow and develop on an age-related timetable. Levinson noticed that adults in the latter half of their lives are more reflective, and as they approach a point in their lives where they had more time behind them than ahead of them, this reflection is intensified. In other words, the older we get, the more we reflect on the life we've lived. The themes in Levinson's theory most relevant to behavioral science professionals include this notion of taking stock of one's life choices and accomplishments and the need to be able to give back to society. This concept encompasses an acknowledgement that at some point the goal in life is not solely to focus on one's own driving needs, but to give back to others and the community through the sharing of gained wisdom and mentoring. Levinson's belief that as people age, they need to become more intrinsically focused, to become more internally anchored, more intrinsic in their self-identity, meaning we must look inward to become more find peace within ourselves, to find that sense of contentment, to find that peace that we can die with dignity and happiness. Then we have Tornstam's Gerotranscendence. Gerotranscendence explains how an individual moves from a strong connection to the material world to transcending above the material traits and into a more existential approach to the world. So what is existentialism? It is the search for meaning in life through free will, choice, and personal responsibility. Now, it does not mean that God does not exist, but what it says is that you have to find and create your own meaning. In other words, you can do the right thing, you can do good things for people, but it has to be done for your sense of personal responsibility, not to appease some mystical or spiritual God that may or may not exist, but for your own sense of this is the right thing to do. Tornstam defined 3 dimensions in which gerotranscendence occurs: the self, the social or personal, and cosmic. Within the self, older adults tend to become less self-centered. They begin to view life and death in new ways, finding a new appreciation for the life they have lived, become less focused on the physical aspect of appearance. So when you go and you see some old lady or old guy and they're wearing socks and sandals, or they look like their hair hasn't been brushed that day, they don't care. They don't care. They are focused on other things in their lives. Number 2, the social or personal. Older adults may become less judgmental and react with an open mind. The number of relationships with others often decreases as older adults focus more energy on the meaningful relationships in their lives and become more selective about who they spend their time with. Why spend time with people you don't like? They want to spend time with the people they really appreciate. Finally, the cosmic dimension. Those who were already spiritual earlier in life become more connected to their spirituality, whereas others who were never spiritual find a connection to the spiritual realm. Time ultimately is viewed as unimportant because, it is a continuum. We begin and we end, but all of that time we've lived in our lives, when we look back on it, seems so fast. And when we're a child, when we're 6 or 7 years old and we're waiting for just our mom to finish at the grocery store, it seems like an eternity. So time really changes in terms of how we perceive it as we get older. So what is successful aging? And this is important to the study of geriatrics, which is used to describe the process of getting the most out of one's life in our later years. Researchers have examined individuals who age better than others to determine what differences might account for their quote-unquote success, and some of the variables at play include 1. Maintaining a moderately high physical and social activity level, and 2. Keeping active with hobbies, social events, and regular exercise. So being out there, being amongst others, and having things to do. That's how you successfully age. However, the problem becomes we tend to reduce our activity levels as we age. When we retire from work, we lose opportunities for social interaction. And, for the most of us, when we work, we may not be best buddies with most of our coworkers, but hey, what'd you do over the weekend? What are you doing for lunch today? We have all these opportunities to interact with people, even on a superficial social way. But that goes away once we retire. Older people begin withdrawing from the world, both physically and socially, in response to diminished mental capacities and weakened physical endurance and abilities. So if you can't see very well, you may not want to drive very much. If you can't walk very well, you may not want to go shopping or go to the mall. With disengagement comes an increase in physical and emotional problems, such as depression and even alcohol abuse to combat loneliness. No matter what happens, there's always a bottle of scotch that will keep you company. Next, we're going to talk about the psychological resilience in older populations. A very recent study seems to indicate the good psychological health is the most psychological resources such as a good self-efficacy and resilience were more strongly linked to successful aging than were biological and social factors. So if you have a good sense of being able to accomplish things on your own, and you bounce back pretty well from disappointments, you are going to age better than somebody who feels like they can't accomplish much and really get down in the dumps and are unable to bounce back. Psychological resilience enables older adults to manage these multiple losses in a healthier manner, even perhaps finding some existential meaning in facing these losses with a sense of wisdom and acceptance despite the pain and sense of powerlessness many older adults may feel. And here's the reality. When you get old, everything hurts. Even when something doesn't hurt, it still hurts a little. So, one of the big problems older adults feel is that they don't have control over their physical body anymore. And that lack of control has a huge psychological effect on them. The Older Americans Act was signed into federal law in 1965. This act led to the creation of the Administration on Aging, and it funded grants to the states for various community and service programs, and provided money for age-related research and the development of human service agencies called Area Agencies on Aging, or AAA, AAA, not to be confused with the Motor Vehicle Agency. The Administration on Aging acts as a clearinghouse, disseminating information about a number of issues affecting the older adult population in the United States. Issues such as elder abuse, grandparenting, age-based discrimination, adjusting to retirement, housing needs, and the biopsychosocial problems such as depression, anxiety, and alcoholism. Next, we'll talk about prejudice against the elderly, which is a huge issue, as I mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint. Ageism is a systematic stereotyping of and discrimination against people simply because they are old. Ageism typically involves any attitude or behavior that negatively categorizes older adults based either on partial truth or myths of the aging process. Now, obviously, for some people this stuff is true, but it's a partially true, because every time you point to somebody who is incapacitated, I can point to somebody who is vigorous despite being elderly. Such myths often describe old age as involving poor health, illness and disability, lack of mental sharpness and acuity, senility, dementia, sadness, depression, loneliness, an irritable demeanor, a sexless life, and that is truly a myth because the rate of sexually transmitted diseases is super high amongst the elderly. Let that sink in for a moment. Routine boredom, a lack of vitality and continual decline, and an inability to do much and loss. The point being is that, yes, some of these are true, absolutely, but not for every older person. And that's what we have to remember, is that in the same way you could say, well, all Italians like pasta. Well, I bet you can all find an Italian who doesn't like pasta. Say all Irish people are drunks. Well, I can bet you can find Irish people who are not drunks. There are always going to be stereotypes, but there's always going to be people who do not fit those stereotypes. And you have to reject the stereotypes and look at individuals as who they are, not who they, represent as a monolithic group. So a further risk of ageism is that older adults may internalize this negative stereotype, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. This is similar to what happens with other vulnerable populations, such as minority groups who internalize the negative perceptions of them held by the majority population. So, a lot of times young black men have heard over and over that they are thugs and violent and angry and uneducated, and unfortunately this has become internalized in a lot of these young men, and sadly, this has resulted in a huge incarceration of young black men in the United States, which is absolutely a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, as well as some, institutionalized racism. What we have to do as behavioral health specialists is understand that these are stereotypes and misconceptions, and we have to not only fight people who are not elderly from having these misconceptions, but also reject these misconceptions from the people who are older and make them understand it is never going to be a stereotype if you reject the stereotype. Housing and the elderly. Contrary to the common belief of many in the United States, most older adults remain in their homes or their adult children's homes until death and are cared for by family members. So we have this image of, old people dying alone in a nursing home, their family off doing whatever they want to do. Well, it's not actually like that. Most families love and care for their older family members. Many choose to move to a retirement community where they can enjoy their independence while enjoying many facility-offered services to meet their needs, such as a shuttle service, handicapped accessible facilities, and child-free living. It's not that older people don't like children, it's just that older people have their own ways of doing things. So, for example, do they want children running and screaming on Saturday night at 10 o'clock when they want to watch TV and rest and do whatever? So it's just, again, it's not that they hate children, it's just that it's not compatible with their lifestyle choices. There is government-subsidized adult housing for older people, and this can make housing costs more affordable for the older adult population who may not have the money or resources to afford assisted living. And this can be in the form of a subsidy, tax credits, loans, rental vouchers, or subsidies. One problem is housing that is not appropriate for older residents who often need special age-related accommodations. A common problem is related to safety, including problems with poor physical upkeep of the property. So, again, people who do not have the financial resources to maintain a lifestyle that is consistent with what their needs are have the most trouble in terms of maintaining a psychologically resilient attitude. A longitudinal study followed 1,200 older adults from 1995 to 2003 in their transition from independent living to age-restricted housing. They found that those adults who transitioned to more expensive communities fared the best with regard to physical health and overall life satisfaction. Those who transitioned to government-subsidized housing programs fared the worst. So the conclusion to this research showed the quality of housing has a direct relationship to life satisfaction. Again, we know as behavioral health specialists that if you have a middle class, upper middle class lifestyle, you are going to live longer, you're going to be in a better place psychologically, biologically, in terms of your health and with your life satisfaction. People on the lower end of the economic scale always suffer in a biopsychosocial way. So, there are issues that come along with poverty, and, older people who live in poverty fare worse than people who are middle class or upper middle class who are elderly. Assisted living facilities offer apartment-like living in a more structured environment. They often provide a bridge between independent living and a nursing home care, offering assistance with activities of daily life, which is far more intensive support than in a retirement community. Residents in assisted living facilities are there because they cannot manage their ADLs without daily assistance, things like taking a shower, getting dressed, taking care of their personal hygiene, things like that. So, these are where your assistants come in who work with the elderly and can provide them the support they need in order to, go about their day. Homelessness in the older adult population is a growing concern because the percentage is expected to grow as the baby boomer generation gets older. The older adult population in general has additional risk factors, such as being too old to sufficiently recover from a job loss, enter a new career, or re-enter the workforce, as well as experiencing chronic illnesses that either are costly or prevent older adults from being self-supporting. Homeless older adults are a particularly vulnerable subgroup because of age-related physical issues, which are often worsened by poor nutrition and difficult living conditions either on the streets or in homeless shelters. They are also at a much higher risk of becoming a victim of crime while living on the streets. So, again, as you get older, society devalues our older people. So it becomes harder to get a new job. It gets harder to enter a new career. It gets harder to do all of these things. And a lot of times people fall through these proverbial cracks. And this is why they end up living on the streets. 85% of the older homeless adults are white. 59% are veterans. The homeless elderly are far more likely to be socially isolated and suffer from a physical illness, but are less likely to suffer from substance abuse. So, we think of old homeless guys sitting on the street drinking cheap wine, but the reality is that they're not. They're not drinking, they're not suffering from drug addiction or alcohol abuse. They are suffering, period. Older homeless adults between the ages of 50 and 65 are often the most vulnerable group because they are frequently the target of ageism when attempting to re-enter the workforce, but they are too young to qualify for Medicare and Social Security benefits. So they're in that pocket where they're too old to learn or to be accepted in a new job. I mean, if you're 60 and you try to get a job at McDonald's and you're homeless, they're going to look at the 20-year-old and say, no, I'll take him instead. You're too young to get Social Security. So you're literally stuck in the middle, and there's not a lot of resources for these folks. Human services and behavioral health programs designed to assist the older adult subgroups with housing issues need to focus more on issues related to having an insufficient income, health concerns, low-income housing, and providing support services to the older adult population who are in declining health. Robert Ashley was one of the first researchers who attempted to describe the retirement experience for men and women. He identified 5 distinct yet overlapping stages that most retirees progress through upon formal retirement. So, many of you may have had parents who retired, and it may have gone well or it may have been a complete disaster, depending on how it happened. These stages are as follows. Number 1, the honeymoon phase. Retirees embrace retirement and all their newfound freedom in an optimistic but unrealistic manner. Number 2, disenchantment. Retirees become disillusioned with what they thought retirement was going to be like and get discouraged with what often feels like too much time on their hands. Number 3, reorientation. Retirees develop a more realistic view of retirement with regard to both increased opportunities and increased constraints. Number 4, stability. Retirees begin to adjust. And number 5, retirees eventually lose independence due to physical and cognitive decline. So it's a process, and much like everything in our lives, it takes time to get used to being retired. We have this fantasy, we work 45 years. We retire. We have this fantasy of playing golf all day or sitting on the couch and watching all the movies or reading all the books we've wanted to read all these years. And the reality is it changes. It's not exactly the way it happens. Our wives or our husbands get annoyed with us, and we have to get used to the idea. Eventually, when we hit stability and we adjust to retirement, it could last 20 years. Many of us retire at 65 and live another 20 years, and we have a great time. So, it is something that, depending on your socioeconomic baseline, you can have this awesome life. Or, there are people who retire and hate it and then, figure out ways to get back into the workforce through volunteering, mentoring, doing all kinds of different things, but they just can't sit at home and be retired. The National Institute of Aging did a study in 2009, and this study found that men and women who continued to work for a period of time after retirement on a part-time or temporary basis which was called the bridge employment, had much better physical and psychological quality during their elderly years, indicating that sudden and complete retirement without any transition may have negative side effects for an older adult's physical and mental health. This positive effects gained from bridge employment existed regardless of the retiree's pre-retirement mental and physical health. So, going down to part-time, going down to temporary work might benefit a retiree before they go right into sitting on the couch all day, making their wife crazy. Time waits for no man or woman. 50% of the U.S. population is now over the age of 50. The human service and behavioral health professionals will inevitably come into contact with retired or retiring adults in many different settings. These professionals must understand that most factors affecting a client's retirement experience are going to be influenced by the client's gender and racial background. So, as much as we try to be this colorblind society, the reality is that if you're a man, it's going to be different than if you're a woman. And if you're white, it's going to be much different than if you are black or Hispanic. And, that's the reality. And in this class, we have to deal with the reality, not with what we hope for. So, grandparents raising their grandchildren has become one of the big issues that we have seen. Now, we've briefly spoken about how grandparents have become a primary daycare provider in many cases, mostly because daycare is so expensive. It can be almost as much as a mortgage payment depending on the daycare a person will use. So grandparents are much more affordable because they're usually free. The practice of grandparents raising grandchildren has increased dramatically over the past several years, signaling many problems within U.S. society that have emerged since the 1970s. So now we're transitioning from grandparents being daycare to grandparents actually taking over the parenting responsibility. As of 2009, which is the most recent statistics available, it is estimated that approximately 6.6 million U.S. households, about 5% of the population, are comprised of grandparents co-residing with grandchildren under the age of 18. And 64% are female grandparent-headed households. Approximately 2.7 million of these families involved grandparents who are primarily responsible for their grandchildren. So, what we're looking at here is not just, the grandparents have their adult children living with them and their grandchildren, but also the grandparents have their grandchildren with them, but their adult children do not live with them. This means that 28% of grandparents in the United States are responsible for raising their grandchildren, which is a significant increase over the past few decades. About 2/3 of these grandparents are between the ages of 50 and 59, and about 1/3 are over the age of 60. Some of these households included at least one of the parents, but many of them included one or both grandparents acting in the role of surrogate parents. Households are far likelier to be an ethnic minority, suffer from poverty, and have low education levels, especially households led by a grandmother. Grandparent caregivers in Southeast United States, so for example, somewhere like South Carolina, and in urban areas, have the highest levels of poverty and the lowest levels of education. Here's a chart that was taken from the textbook that basically gives you a who lives with whom, and you can take a look at this. I'm not going to go over it individually, but you can pause the video and go through this in detail if you are interested. So, there are several reasons why grandparents become surrogate parents, but the chief reasons include the following. Number one, high divorce rates, with women moving home with her parents because she cannot work if she doesn't have affordable childcare. Number 2, teen pregnancies. Number 3, relative-based foster care. And if you remember back when we talked about behavioral health services for children, we talked about the rise of foster care and how child abuse reporting has increased over the last 20-30 years. Parents serving time in prison, drug use, and of course the AIDS crisis, which seems to be leveling off but is still significant in some populations. The issues facing grandparents raising grandchildren are complex, involving emotional as well as financial, legal, and physical challenges. Parenting younger children comes with some level of social support. So, in kindergarten, elementary school, there's a lot of support given to the child, to the grandparents. But when you move into that adolescent era, you can often see the significant challenges out there, and it's a significant challenge for anyone raising an adolescent, not just grandparents. But there's less social support because everyone is dealing with our insane teenagers. So there is a much higher level of stress on a very vulnerable family system. Human service and behavioral health professionals may enter a grandparent-led family system in a number of ways, including through the school social worker working with the children, through the child welfare caseworker assigned to assist the grandparents who are serving as relative foster care parents, or through a human services agency offering outreach services to grandparent caregivers. So there's a variety of methods. One of the biggest issues, though, is that a lot of grandparents don't realize the services are in fact available. So now we're moving on to aging and depression if you're not already depressed about getting old. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that approximately 2 million individuals over the age of 65 suffer from some form of depression, as well as 5 million more suffer from some sort of depressive symptoms. 5 to 30% of the older adult population may suffer from some sort of depression, compared to a 6.7% prevalence rate in the general population, which is they are numbers from the National Institute of Health from 2015, and I know those numbers are different from your textbook, but these are updated numbers. Research shows that 50% of patients in nursing homes meet the criteria for clinical depression. Individuals aged 65 years and older make up about 12% of the U.S. population. They account for nearly 16% of those who committed suicide in the year 2004, which is the highest rate of all age groups. So you have a very high rate of suicide among senior citizens. The highest risk for suicide are white males over the age of 85, many of whom are widowed. So these are the folks that tend to eat their guns, take too many meds, and oftentimes you don't hear about it, because when you hear that somebody who's 87, 88 years old died, you just assume they died from natural causes. So what does a behavioral health specialist look for? So risk factors for depression and anxiety include a chronic medical condition such as heart disease, stroke, or diabetes, being unmarried, especially males. They have a really hard time not being married when they're older. Alcohol abuse, stressful life events, minimal social support, and dementia. Now we're going to talk about dementia in detail. The American Psychiatric Association defines dementia as a progressive, degenerative illness experienced during old age that impairs brain function and cognitive ability. Two of the most common forms of dementia are Alzheimer's disease and multi-infarct dementia, which means small strokes in the brain. The general symptoms of dementia include the shutting down of all bodily systems and memory loss, as well as increasing difficulty concentrating, a decrease in problem-solving skills and judgment capability, confusion, hallucinations, delusions, altered sensations or perceptions, impaired recognition of everyday objects and familiar people, altered sleep patterns, motor system impairment, inability to maintain ADLs, remember those are activities of daily life such as dressing oneself, agitation, anxiety, and depression. Ultimately, the person suffering from dementia enters a completely vegetative state before they ultimately die. There has been an increase in the incidence of dementia due to the increase in our human lifespan. So, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, multi-infarct dementia accounts for nearly 20% of all dementias, affecting about 4 in 10,000 people. Alzheimer's disease affects approximately 4.5 million, or 5% of the population, between the ages of 65 and 74 years of age. These numbers increase to 50% for those over 85. So the older you get, the more likely dementia will kick in. Diagnosis is often made on symptoms, but it is only through an autopsy that a definitive diagnosis can be made. Professionals may work directly with the sufferer of dementia or with the caregiver if they work in a practice setting that serves the older adult community. So next we're going to talk about something called elder abuse. Now, we hear about child abuse on a regular basis, but elder abuse is the other side of the coin. This is taking another vulnerable population and putting them in an exploitive situation. Older adults are a vulnerable population due to physical frailty, dependence, social isolation, and the existence of cognitive impairment, and are as such at risk of various forms of abuse and exploitation. The National Center on Elder Abuse defines elder abuse as any knowing, intentional, or negligent act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable adult. The specific definition of elder abuse varies from state to state, but in general can include abandonment or financial exploitation. So you're looking after grandma's got a nice chunk of change in the bank, you have access to her checkbook, you start writing out checks for a few little things, and then you want to go to the Bahamas for Christmas, so you write out bigger checks, and before you know it, you've stolen all of grandma's money. That is, in fact, elder abuse. Elder abuse was not legally defined until addressed within a 1987 amendment of the Older Americans Act, which significantly increased reporting requirements. In 1986, there were 117,000 reports of elder abuse nationwide. By 1996, the number of abuse reports increased to 293,000. 4 years later, in 2000, the number had risen to 472,000. One of the reasons for the rise in abuse reports is the mandate to report abuse in institutional settings like nursing homes. Elder abuse is expected to continue to rise because of increased lifespan and increase in chronic illnesses, changing family patterns, and the complexity involved with contemporary caregiving. 60% of all reported abuse victims are women, 65% of all abuse victims are white, 60% of all abuse incidences occurred in domestic settings, meaning the home. Only 8% of abuse incidences occurred in institutionalized settings. So we tend to think of these environments, in nursing homes. But the reality is most of these occur in the home itself by family members. And this also includes spouses and adult children. In March 2010, the Elder Justice Act of 2009 was passed and signed into law by President Obama as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This act sets forth numerous provisions for addressing the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of older adults, both in the form of preventative and responsive measures. So in the same way that there are child protective services in every state in the United States has an adult protective services agency. There is significant variation between states, particularly related to reporting laws and investigation methods and policies specifically related to who is considered a mandated reporter. And remember, for children, it's basically anyone related to a job that interacts with children, like a teacher, a daycare counselor, a nurse. 16 states require anyone who is aware of elder abuse to report it. Although reported more often than it used to be, elder abuse tends to be grossly underreported, but many cite the lack of uniform reporting requirements as the primary reason. It is essential that those working in the behavioral health field be aware of the elder abuse reporting laws and the requirements in their state. So, who abuses the elderly? You kind of have this idea of some horrible person. Well, the reality is that oftentimes the person who's doing the abuse is either the spouse or the adult child of the person. And one of the issues is that it is due to caregiver burnout. Caring for someone with Alzheimer's or dementia is the most frustrating and difficult job a person can have, and it can provoke an abusive response from someone who has never been abusive ever in their life before. Effective intervention strategies can include a caregiver support group, which provides caregivers a safe place to express their frustrations, sadness, and other feelings related to caring for their dependent older adult loved one. So somebody with Alzheimer's may not recognize their adult children. They may call the police on their adult children. They may forget to turn off the oven. They may leave the faucet running and cause a flood. It is a very frustrating situation to be in. Area agencies on aging, as we discussed, serve as a clearinghouse offering direct services to the older adult community on a local level, such as nutritional programs, services for homebound older adults, low-income minority older adults, as well as a referral source for programs for those suffering from Alzheimer's, including caregiver respite. They also provide hotlines for emergency home energy assistance programs. In other words, when the gas gets shut off for somebody's not paying their bill, a senior citizen can get their heat turned back on. Paralegal services, home care for older adults, Medicaid waivers, practitioners, counseling, bereavement help, hospice services, and case management services. Other practice settings include adult daycare, geriatric assessment units, nursing home facilities, veterans services, elder abuse programs, and adult protective services. One of the biggest problems we have with these issues is that a lot of older adults are not aware of these services because they don't use the internet like somebody who is in their 30s or 40s might. So it becomes a matter of reaching out and finding them so they know the services are available. So we're going to move into talking about special populations. As the older adult population has increased in numbers, the government has shifted its priorities and began developing programs aimed at long-term healthcare needs, with a particular focus on vulnerable populations such as women, ethnic minorities, and adults living in rural communities. A 2004 study showed a link between good health and financial stability, finding that Caucasians tend to have a greater economic wealth and better health than the African American and Latino populations. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that We as a society need to do a better job of helping African American and Hispanic populations move up the economic ladder in order for them to reap good health and financial stability. So why are women a special population? I mean, we're half the population, so what makes us special? Women are often considered a special population because as a group we are more prone to depression and typically have a worse response to antidepressant medications. We also experience greater financial vulnerability if divorced or widowed. Prior to the 1980s, most women got married, had children, and looked after their homes. They did not work outside their homes, or if they did, it was a fairly low-level job. These women were faced with financial devastation if their husbands divorced them or if their husbands died. That's what makes them a vulnerable population. So if your mother or your grandmother ever said to you, always have your own money, it's because when they were growing up, they didn't have their own money. These women often tended to have lower wage jobs, were less educated, and didn't have much insurance. Keeping in mind that 75% of women over the age of 65 are unmarried because they're widowed. Men die earlier than women. Men tend to die between 5 and 7 years earlier than women due to a variety of factors. Women are built for endurance, men are built for strength. So as a consequence to that, there are going to be several years that women will be widowed and need to be able to manage on their own. Research has also shown a link between stress and racism that affects quality of life. A study conducted in 2002 found that racism, and particularly institutionalized racism, tends to impact black men more than any other group. Other research has shown how institutionalized racism can lead to feelings of invisibility, stress, depression, and ultimately despair as the person experiences a sense of futility in combating a lifetime of discrimination and white privilege. So if you've spent your whole life trying to get your piece of the pie and then having it chipped away at, all those forks coming in and taking that pie away from you, you just give up after a while. Finally, older adults living with physical or mental disability have very specific and demanding psychosocial and physical needs. So if you have somebody who has Down syndrome, and again, these folks, we thought they usually died by the time they were in their early 20s. Well, now they're living longer and longer with the advances in medical care. How do we deal with somebody who's in their 50s and 60s who has Down syndrome? Do we institutionalize them? How do we keep them in a safe environment? Individuals who live in isolated rural areas face unique risks. Alienation, not enough medical attention nearby, and lack of other resources. If you live on a ranch in the middle of Wyoming and there is not a store or a doctor for 50 miles, how do you manage that, even with a cell phone? Behavioral health professionals who are well versed on typical risk factors facing special populations will be far more effective in protecting and advocating for their older adult clients. So if you do work with older adult clients, it's important to understand who is in the environment where you're working. Finally, we're going to talk about the term gerontology. Gerontology refers to the care related to old age, the process of aging, and the particular problems of old people. Working with older adults remains a rather unpopular career pursuit for professionals across the globe, but it is growing, and that's the issue here, is you're not working with kids who are cute and sweet. You're working with older people who ultimately will die. So a lot of people are reluctant to get into a field like that, but it's a hugely growing field. So if you're looking for a field that is never going to go away and also growing, this is a good field to get into. A commitment on the part of several educational accreditation agencies is to increase an infusion of gerontology issues into educational curriculum, like this one here, as well as financial incentives such as scholarships and stipends for students in gerontological field placements is believed to be making a difference in the number of students who select gerontology as their career focus. The fact of the matter is, if you can make money doing something, people will do it. So there you go. Anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thank you.